the defendant and all counsel. Ms. Laviolette, you are still under oath. Do you understand?
Yes.
I'm going to continue to ask the jurors questions. Please explain why you feel Jodi is not manipulative either before or after the killing based on the review of statements and interviews.
Based on the information that I have, I don't see a pattern of manipulation in the way I would define it. I haven't seen that in terms of her trying to, and I'm not sure exactly what this is in reference to, so it's a hard question for me to answer, but I think anybody can be manipulative. What I look for are patterns, and I didn't see them in the materials that I read in terms of her relationship with Mr. Alexander, so I'm not sure how else to answer that.
On the one side, we have demeaning multiple verbal slurs, a slap, a shove, a chokehold, and a lunge perpetrated on Jodi. On the other, we have a gunshot to the head, a 4-inch deep slit throat, and close to 30 stab wounds delivered by Jodi to Travis. Is not the perpetrator of the greatest domestic violence Jodi?
I think what happened to Mr. Alexander is horrific.
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
I
think that self-defense.
Objection, beyond the order, beyond the scope of the question.
There's no order.
I'm going to sustain the objection. The question is not the perpetrator of the greatest domestic violence Jodi?
No.
In the hypothetical given by Mr. Martinez about it being possible Travis was the one who told Jodi he wanted her to leave, if that were true, then isn't it likely Travis never hit her that day?
I can only go on the materials that I've read and the materials, by the way, that were available to me. And when I look at that, I don't have face-to-face corroboration that he hit her that day. What I have is evidence that as she began to pull away, things escalated.
When Jodi went to confront Bianca about being with Matt McCartney, can't that be seen as she did it because she was jealous?
It could be seen that way. It could be seen that way. The nature of the confrontation didn't seem to be hostile from either Miss Arias's report or Mr. McCartney's. So in that way, she could have been motivated by jealousy, but the confrontation or the talk didn't seem to be hostile.
Jodi went through Travis's emails, text messages, and his inbox of his MySpace page. Did you take any of that into consideration when making your assessment?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
You bought Miss Arias books, apologized upon meeting her, and ordered her a magazine subscription. Did you do anything else to establish a relationship with Jodi?
Simply talking to her and meeting with her would be the things that I did, spending the hours in jail talking to her, but no, nothing else. I mean, other than the conversation.
Have you given her anything else?
No, I haven't.
Have you ever had any physical contact with her, hugs, friendly touching, etc.?
Well, I don't think so. I might have touched her arm, I don't know, but in jail there's a screen or a piece of plexiglass, and you're kept from that person, and that was my meetings with Miss Arias, other than what you've seen here in court.
How do you know Jodi received Spider-Man underwear from Travis on Valentine's Day? Did you see them, pictures, or anything else?
The only thing I saw was the text message between the two of them where she told him she was bringing the Spider-Man underwear. That's what I saw.
How many men have you testified for in criminal court?
I haven't testified much in criminal court, but how many men? I wrote a report for one man.
Beyond the scope, how many men has she testified for?
Sustained.
I haven't testified much. So one or two.
If you had been given access to everything except interviews with Jodi, how would your opinion have varied, if at all?
I think that I would have come to the same conclusion, because part of what I read were interactions I read about the interactions between Miss Arias and Mr. Alexander. I read Mr. and Mrs. Hughes' responses. I read the interactions between other women and Mr. Alexander. I read Mr. Alexander's parts of his journal, and I think the first page of his MySpace, and I also read the collateral interviews. So those were the things that, even if I hadn't been able to interview Miss Arias, I would have found sufficient information.
Would you have adjusted your belief in the level of abuse? Would you have adjusted your belief in the level of abuse if you had been given access to everything except the interviews with Jodi?
No, because once again, given my experience and working with people who are violent and people who have been abusive, the level of psychological abuse, the level of character assassination was incredibly high in that case. And you can have cases where people are just so apprehensive and afraid of what's going to happen because of the escalation in that verbal and emotional abuse.
Other than what Jodi has told you, in what other sources did you see evidence of physical violence by Travis?
I actually didn't see other evidences of physical violence by Travis, other than what Ms. Arias told me.
Would your analysis of this relationship change if, hypothetically speaking, you found out that the stories about physical violence and Travis's masturbating to children were made up?
I would still rely on what I know about the psychological abuse. And as I've said before, when I've worked with victims of purely psychological abuse, they feel intimidated and afraid and apprehensive and very much put down, and often say that abuse for them is worse than the physical abuse that they've endured.
Regarding nonverbal communication, do you think that you can read through a string of emails, text messages, instant messages between two people and know exactly what the nonverbal communication is?
No.
How do you know tone, meaning, inside jokes, and/or the meaning if you cannot get both sides of the story?
Well, there would be no way for me to interview Mr. Alexander, but I read so much of what he put together. And if you look at history, we take written documentation as evidence of many things when we're not able to interview the players in the situation. We have to rely on the written evidence that we have. and I had a fair amount of written evidence that I relied on.
You said other sources said Jodi was not manipulative. Who are these sources?
Mr. McCartney and Mr. Brewer, who were her previous boyfriends who she had longer-term relationships with. And when she was a little older, I didn't read about her being manipulative by her sisters or her brother. So there was this period when she was young and a teenager where I would have to say any of us who've been teenagers know we can be pretty manipulative. But as an adult, in her adult relationships, I didn't hear her described that way at all.
When interviewing Jodi, you claimed you did not ask leading questions. If someone asks a specific question that elicits a simple yes or no response, would you consider that a leading question?
Gosh, I've been asked a lot of yes or no questions, and I think they're questions. I don't know that they're leading questions. I work very hard not to ask leading questions, but it doesn't mean I haven't. But it's not my intention to do that, and I try very hard not to do that.
You say Travis gives no indication of being stalked, displays no fearful behavior, and continues his contact with Jodi of his own accord. How do you reconcile Jodi's claim of domestic violence if she continues her contact with Travis of her own accord? Where was her fearful behavior?
Domestic violence and stalking in domestic violence relationships or stalking outside of them tend to be different. What you see most frequently with battered women is that they go back and forth, and that happens in most of these relationships. We don't see people leave and stay gone. And their fear tends to develop over a longer period of time. With stalking, fear tends to develop over a shorter period of time, and the relationship between the stalker, for instance, in domestic violence, when the real stalking occurs is usually when the person has totally left the relationship and there is not a desire for ongoing contact. So the relationship between a stalker and the person they're stalking is different than the relationship between two people who love each other and are not decided on whether to stay or leave.
Do you consider someone who says, "No jury will ever convict me," to be a person with low self-esteem?
It sounds like a really foolish statement to me. I don't know what to say about self-esteem, but it doesn't seem like a good statement to make, that's for sure.
How can you say that Jodi and Travis's relationship was domestic abuse when there is no proof other than name-calling on paper and Jodi's word?
It's the degree of name-calling, it's the degree of put-down, it's the level of escalation, and it's the words of his two closest friends and his relationships with other women that aren't close. So it's not just from Jodi's words or the words on paper between the two of them, but that certainly, I mean, those kind of words, I don't think anyone would want their daughter called those kind of words, and they would be very upset about it. Or someone they loved, male or female, called those kind of words. They would see it as abusive, and I don't know anybody in my field who would not see it as abusive.
Do you handle cases where the female is the abuser?
Yes, I do.
Did Travis discuss abuse of Jodi or any other women in his journal entries?
No, he didn't.
In all of the evidence you reviewed, was there any indication anywhere of Travis claiming stalking by anyone else other than Jodi?
No, I don't believe so.
Of the times you have testified in other cases, how many of these were in defense of men?
Not just criminal, but overruled. I've also worked in family law. So I would say of the 18 times I've testified that I have worked 3 or 4. And defense has a broader brush. I don't know if I can explain that. Okay. What I mean by that is I've had referrals, for instance, for men who have been accused of beating their wives and children. And I've worked with the attorney, but we've also worked to get intervention for the person.
Sustained. What is the manifesto you referred to during your testimony?
I actually don't know because I've never seen it. I don't know what somebody said there was a manifesto, but it's nothing I've ever seen.
Is there a type of stalking, or what could be considered stalking, that a person is comfortable around someone in person or when they are speaking with them, but are afraid of what they will do or what they are capable of when they are not around?
When you look at abuse and lower end battering, there's during the pull apart time when people are moving apart, coming back together, there's the disbelief from either person that the relationship is going to end. And in that case, they go back and forth together, and there might even be a protective order. They might get together for dinner. That's very common, actually, the violation of a protective order at the beginning of a case. So as long as they're still engaged in the relationship to some degree, there might be that back and forth, but that's not stalking. Stalking, what you see in domestic violence with stalking is once that stalker knows you mean business, once you're gone, that's when their behavior will escalate and get worse.
When speaking of blackmail and being threatened, are you aware that Jodi threatened Travis by saying she would let out that he was a pedophile?
I was not aware of that.
Does that mean anything to you?
Yes. Of course it means something to me. Yes.
You stated that it would be beneficial for Jodi to write things she was lying about in her journal to buck up her story. How would she write about these things in her journal if her story didn't change until well after the killing, hypothetically speaking?
If she had planned something, if she had planned on being separated from Travis, it seems like she would be building up a story that would include all of this. I don't see a plan here to separate from Travis and to build a domestic violence case.
Regarding the text message from Travis to Jodi, where he is upset about her BS story from Michelle K. or Elena, what exactly was the BS story that Jodi told Travis?
The BS story was that this woman came into the restaurant and told Jodi that Mr. Alexander was having a relationship with Lisa Andrews, which in fact was true.
Where did you get this information?
Well, I got the information about which?
The BS story.
The information about the BS story actually came from looking at the overlap in the communications and what was said with what Ms. Arias gave me, but also reading what Lisa Andrews wrote. And she was, in fact, having a relationship with Mr. Alexander at the time. So it wasn't a BS story.
You stated that Travis was the one lying in this message. How do you know this for sure?
Because I read the information from Lisa Andrews, and Lisa Andrews was talking about their relationship at the time. So there was corroboration from Lisa Andrews.
How can you know that Jodi's BS story was not a lie? Not the subject, but the actual story that was told.
I can't. I don't know the actual story that was told to Mr. Alexander.
You seem to believe that when the argument began between Jodi and Travis prior to the Havasupai trip, when he followed her upstairs, that he only wanted to pursue an argument. How do you know he did not want to get the issue resolved and calm her, and may have been embarrassed at her behavior in front of the Freemans?
I don't know that, and I didn't use that heavily in my assessment.
Can you explain how Miss Arias can remember physical abuse incidents so vividly, but does not write anything, not even a reference to her feelings, in her journal?
About the incidents, about those incidents?
I'll read it again. Can you explain how Miss Arias can remember physical abuse incidents so vividly, but does not write anything, not even a reference to her feelings, in the journal?
I believe that, well, there were different places that she wrote references to her feelings, but I can't explain what somebody does, but I know that people remember things that they don't write down.
You testified writings could have supported her statements. However, is it possible the incidents of abuse reported by Jodi were reported after the fact as a secondary gain to benefit her?
That's possible. That's possible. I didn't rely just on her oral or verbal report.
Do you have any evidence other than Jodi's word that Travis made her tear out pages and write only positive thoughts?
No, I don't.
Who from Jodi's past did you interview that you were able to rule out Jodi's manipulative behavior being a pattern?
I wasn't able to interview anyone from her past directly. I was given the interviews that were done at the beginning and given all of them to review. So there were, I think, at least 20 collaterals. There were more collateral sources in this case than any case I've ever worked on.
You told us at the beginning of your testimony that you like to meet with each individual before analyzing the relationship. We have heard Jodi's side of the story. Can you tell us Travis's side of the story?
Well, by law, I can't interview.
Rule 7.3, legal opinion.
Overruled. You may continue.
By law, I can't interview Travis's family. I obviously can't interview Mr. Alexander. I did review 7 hours of unedited footage regarding Mr. Alexander that people spoke very well of him in that interview, friends of his and his family, and I was able to look at that. I was also able to look at some of the things he did that were very kind and generous, and some of the ways that he made people laugh and motivated people. So I didn't feel for myself that he was a one-dimensional human being at all. I felt that there were very good parts of Mr. Alexander that, and I see that with people I work with. You don't hook up and make a relationship with someone who doesn't have lots of good traits. You value those traits, and I think Mr. Alexander had some outstanding traits.
You mentioned that stalking could fall under the abuse and battering columns in your continuum. If that is true, why is stalking excluded from those columns?
Actually, because when I do that in training, when I talk about that, I call it normal stalking, which I kind of described as that period where neither party believes each other. I don't believe that you're going to leave, and you don't believe I'm going to stop hurting you. And so we pull back and forth. And so it is very common, for instance, that if a survivor takes out a protective order, that their partner, because it's worked in the past to push on them, believes that they can keep pushing. And it's not until the person actually enforces the protective order that they change their mind, when they see you mean business. So I discuss it as normal. I call it normal stalking, but it really could be called the pulling away of the relationship.
Is your continuum incomplete? Why not list all appropriate bullet points for the appropriate column?
Yes, my continuum is incomplete. It is. I'm messing with it all the time. I've been changing it and messing with it since 1998. I don't know how to make it complete unless I were to do, it would look like the Dead Sea Scroll. It would be so thick, and I just don't have, I just kind of have it as a framework for people to look at, and there are other people who go into more detail than I do, but there are people that go into less detail than I do who do this work. So, yes, it's incomplete.
You stated that you have chosen not to take cases in the past because you did not believe an individual. Did you take this case in part because you believed Jodi?
Yes.
If you did not believe her, would you have chosen to turn it down?
Yes.
If you start out believing in an individual, doesn't that, by default, set up prejudices toward their partner?
No, because I have had cases where, as I pursue them, I have found that I do not find this credible, and I have talked to the attorneys. I mean, what I say to people at the beginning of a case is, I can investigate this, and if I don't believe it, I'm not going to testify. If I don't find enough credible evidence, I'm not going to testify. So I have, been involved in cases where I drop them, or, advise the attorney, or maybe I'm not the appropriate expert. Maybe they need an expert in something other than domestic violence in this case. And so maybe they need somebody in drug abuse, and then I'll refer them to somebody I think might be good. But I don't have a great retirement after 34 years. But
Sustained. You stated that regarding anger, it is more common for someone to have a burst of anger than calm down. Is it possible that Travis's rants seem longer because they are being viewed in text form?
actually, they go on over a period, I believe, of 2 to 3 hours, which is pretty long, and then followed up with the other.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained? Pardon?
She's speaking generally.
Well, continue with your response.
There were long rants that the longest one I'm thinking of is like 2 to 3 hours.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Overruled. You may continue.
It was I think it was the 526, but the detail, the date is not as important to me as the context of what's happening, and the general framework of the rant. But there was a follow-up. There was a text message, and then, as I said, I get these things mixed up, the IMs and the text. But this went on for another, I think, it says when it started, and I think it went on for 16 pages or something like that. So it's an extensive length of time.
Can you explain what you mean by a burst of anger? Could a 10 or 20-minute rant be described as a burst?
A 10 or 20-minute rant could be described as a burst. What you would look at is what happens during that 10 or 20-minute. When I work with somebody who's breaking things and throwing things in a 10 or 20-minute burst. It's different than somebody who's storming around the house or muttering under their breath. So you look at the quality of what's happening, not just the burst.
If a couple has an argument that takes all day to end, can they still be in a healthy relationship?
Yes, absolutely.
Would that type of argument indicate abuse?
It wouldn't have to indicate abuse at all. No.
Is it possible for two people to be abusive to each other?
Yes.
Don't you believe that Travis making comments about a 12-year-old girl while having a phone sex conversation with Jodi is fundamentally different than Travis allegedly masturbating to photos of young boys?
I think it's different. It's just an unusual comment to make from a 30-year-old man about a 12-year-old girl.
Would you characterize your knowledge of June 4, 2008 as light or incomplete?
I think some of the detail of where something happened, I'm clearer on it now, but I knew in general what happened. I was focused on what led up to June 4th and then what happened June 4th, and I think I know enough about what happened June 4th.
Are you confused on any of the details of that afternoon?
Well, I was. I said that I believe that the shot was fired in the closet, and it wasn't. So I'm not sure if I'm confused about anything else about that or not, but I think I know most of the detail.
Do you think it is deceptive for someone to not share the most private and intimate details of their lives, like their sexual activities, with their friends and family, or would you consider it normal to keep those things private?
I think most people keep the details of their sexual lives private.
If normal, why do you think Travis's attempts to keep those things private is deceptive?
I don't think him keeping his private life, his sexual life private is deceptive. I think putting himself out as someone who obeys the laws of chastity and is a 30-year-old virgin is deceptive.
Did you ever see evidence that Jodi was openly sharing all of her most private sexual details with her friends and family?
No, I didn't.
Would you consider that deceptive?
No, I don't. She never claimed to be a virgin. She never put herself out in that way, although certainly she was part of the Mormon faith and not going along with the laws of chastity.
You say Jodi's lies started after she killed Travis. How could you possibly know this?
I can only go on the reports of people in her life prior to that. And once again, primarily the two men that she spent most of her adult, her 20s with. And that would be Matt McCartney and Daryl Brewer, neither of whom described her as a liar.
Do you believe that Jodi was subjected to sexual degradation at the hands of Travis?
I believe she participated in that relationship. I believe that she went along with things. Some of the things may not have been her favorite things to go along with, and I believe that she wanted to be in that relationship and went further than she should and didn't honor her own boundaries.
You stated that you saw no signs of Travis feeling or experiencing sexual degradation at the hands of Jodi, noting his desire to see Jodi in California, his actions on the sex call, and comments in various texts, instant messages, etc. Couldn't that same argument be made regarding Jodi's alleged sexual degradation, given her desire to see Travis, her actions on the sex call, and various comments in instant messages, texts, etc.?
Yes, I've not heard, actually, I've not heard Jodi say that she felt sexually degraded and humiliated. I have not heard her, to me, I have not heard her testimony, so I don't know what was said there. But she has not made claims in that direction.
If you were to only consider the written conversations and journals, excluding your interview with Jodi, did you see abuse? Please explain.
If I were to exclude
If you were to only consider the written conversations and journals, excluding your interview with Jodi, did you see abuse? Please explain.
I'm confused by that. I'm thinking that it's about Jodi's journal and my interviews with Jodi. If I excluded those things and still used the rest of the written documentation that I got, I would still see that as abuse.
What level or degree would you place that abuse?
I think the verbal abuse was in battering. I don't think it was in abuse. I don't think it elevated to some of the things I've seen in terrorism. It was definitely battering.
Considering only the written conversations and journals, can you say you saw an escalation?
The written conversation between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias?
Correct.
Oh yeah, I saw an escalation. You saw it over time. The rants got longer, the put downs got worse, the anger, him talking about his own anger and being, seeing it as scary. That was all in there.
You mentioned Travis was in a 7-year relationship with Deanna. Are you aware of anyone interviewing her to determine if she was a victim or survivor?
I don't know if anyone interviewed Deanna. I didn't see anything that indicated that she was a survivor of abuse.
Did you interview her?
No, I did not.
All right, it looks like we have some additional juror questions in the basket. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any other questions for this witness? If so, please submit them now. Counsel, please approach. You keep saying that Jodi does not match your definition of manipulative. Is it possible that your definition of manipulation differs from others?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Is it possible that your definition is wrong?
Sure.
Yesterday, you were asked about Jodi being an abuser toward her mother, and you stated it was normal teenage behavior. Do you honestly believe that hitting and kicking your parents are normal behavior at any age?
No, I don't believe I said it was normal teenage behavior. I said it was not appropriate teenage behavior, but it is behavior that teenagers do. Do I think it's good behavior? No, I don't think it's good behavior.
No other questions? Follow up? Ms. Wilmot.
Good morning, Ms. Laviolette.
Good morning, Ms. Wilmot.
Actually, let me just start where we just left off about normal teenage behavior. And the question with regard to manipulation. So when we're talking about teenage behavior, something that occurs as a teen, kicking your mother, I just heard you say that's not a good thing.
Right.
When we talk about someone doing that as a teenager, does that necessarily and mandatorily mean that the person grows up and becomes an abuser of her boyfriend?
No.
And from the time that she was a teenager to the time that she's an adult, and I'm talking about Miss Arias, do you see any other behavior that is abusive to anyone else?
No, I don't.
And so when you're taking into account the fact that there was issues with her mother as a teenager, do you also take into account the years and decades that went by from that point to the point that we are now, and to her point with her relationship with Mr. Alexander? I said, do you? Do you take into account the fact that there's a decade more than a decade between the time of an issue with her mother to the time that she's in a relationship with Mr. Alexander?
Yes, I do.
And so if there's no patterns between that time, patterns of abuse with other people or any pattern of abuse with regard to Mr. Alexander, is that important to you?
Yes, it's very important to me.
And in any way, does that mean that you condone her behavior as a teenager?
No, I don't condone her behavior as a teenager.
And speaking of when she was a teenager, are you also aware of the fact that her mother hit her?
Yes, I am.
And so if there was this, if her mother was hitting her, which has not been discussed as much, but if her mother's hitting her and then we hear that she hit her mother, does that add to the understanding, perhaps, of how she acted as a teenager?
It could, yes.
You answered the question about whether or not your idea of manipulation could possibly differ from others and whether or not it would be wrong. Have you worked in your time as a therapist? Have you worked with people who are manipulative?
Yes.
And have you worked with people who might try to manipulate you?
Yes.
And yesterday, I believe you testified about working with people who are trying to build a story of domestic violence.
Correct.
And when you see people trying to build a story of domestic violence with you, is that a form of manipulation?
I find it a form of manipulation.
Okay. And so would that fall under your definition of manipulation?
Somebody trying to weave a story to get me to buy into it?
Yes.
Yes, it would fall under my definition of manipulation.
Okay. And did you see any type of evidence that Jodi was doing that to you?
No, I did not.
And in fact, as you have said numerous times, did you rely on information to this case in your assessment far beyond what Ms. Arias told you?
Yes.
And when you're talking about manipulation, are you talking about, if you were to look at manipulation as with regard to domestic violence relationship, do you look at one incident of manipulation or do you look at patterns?
In domestic violence, I look at patterns when I'm looking at anything.
Okay. And did you see any patterns of manipulation from Jodi to Mr. Alexander?
No, I did not.
There was questions about whether or not you found Miss Arias to be sexually degraded. Remember talking about that just a few minutes ago?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, I think we all know what your continuum looks like by now, right? And I know you do, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so in your continuum, does it list stalking just under terrorizing?
Yes.
And and also under terrorizing, does it list sexual degradation?
Yes.
What did you ultimately conclude with regard to the domestically violent relationship between Jodi and Mr. Alexander? Was it terrorizing? Was it battering? Abuse? What was it?
There's more battering.
Okay. And so in order to get into battering, do you need to have sexual degradation?
No.
And did you find any sexual degradation with regard to Jodi?
It seemed that they were both involved in the sexual relationship.
Okay. And at some point, you were asked about with regard to the sexual degradation, you had previously said about a saying about men give love to get sex and women give sex to get love.
Yes.
Does that count as sexual degradation?
No.
Okay. Is that something that you saw going on here with Jodi as far as what she was doing for Travis or Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
Did you find any writings or anything that supports the fact that Miss Arias wanted to participate in sexual activities with Mr. Alexander because it brought them closer?
Yes, I did. There was I believe it was part of the 526 conversation where she indicated that she could feel closer to him and feel like the relationship was more significant when they were sexual, and that when they were sexual, he treated her differently. He was sweet to her. He seemed to value her, and they had more time together, and that was important to her. And that she said, I was a whore for those feelings. I wanted those feelings that we had when we were together.
And is this all part of the conversation where Mr. Alexander was calling her a whore as well?
Yes.
With regard to that particular conversation and conversations prior to it, and when I say conversations, I mean in written form, right? You were asked questions about character assassination, and isn't that just name calling? Right? Do you remember that?
Yes.
So, in particular, on May 26th, the conversation that goes on, and we know, I don't believe. Do you know the time of how long that conversation took place with regard to the instant messaging?
I get mixed up, but I think that's the one that's about 2 to 3 hours. I think that's the one. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what's the instant message and what's the text.
Okay, instant messaging is the one that has the line after line after line, and the text messages are the one that have boxes. So the one that has line after line, is that about 16 or 18 pages?
Yes.
Okay, and so in that conversation, is that the conversation where you see character assassination?
Yes, I see character assassination.
And where is Mr. Alexander talking to her, telling her that she's a corrupted carcass?
Yes.
And calling her a whore?
Yes.
And a slut?
Yes.
Does he call her names like bitch?
Yes.
And more so with regard, when we're talking about moving from name calling to character assassination, what is the difference between the two? Why are some of these things considered character assassination for you?
Well, part of the reason they're considered character assassination is they go beyond bitch. They go on to calling somebody a slut, a three-hole wonder, someone who doesn't have the conscience of Adolf Hitler, someone who should get tips because of her job for giving blowjobs. It's putting down who the person is. And that is absolutely, I mean, it's assassination of the soul, if you want to look at it that way. It tears apart who you are. It's not just, and I think that would be true for men or women, that to be called names by somebody you love and to be torn apart in that way is so destructive to your character.
And is it different when you are called these horrible names by someone you love versus the public calling you names? Is that different?
Yes, it is.
How is it different?
Because the public doesn't know who you are. Well, hopefully, the public that's calling you names is generic and doesn't know who you are. The person who loves you knows who you are. There's a bond of trust, generally speaking, there. And it's the person that you want to thinks you're the most special person in the world. So when they tear you apart, it's so painful.
Okay. You were asked questions about the comment that Mr. Alexander makes in the phone sex tape about Miss Arias sounding like a 12-year-old girl.
Yes.
And how hot that was, right?
Yes.
Regardless of whether or not he spoke of a girl or whether he was masturbating to pictures of little boys, either way, aren't both of them considered children?
They are considered children.
With regard to your continuum, the fact that you didn't write or list the name stalking under battering and abusive, does that make your continuum incomplete?
Well, I just don't have room for everything on my continuum. And I need to explain to people what I mean by the kind of stalking that can happen in abuse and battering.
Okay. And is that a different kind of stalking then than what you see under terrorizing?
Yes. Or very high on battering.
Or very high? Okay. You were asked a question about how it would be possible for Jodi to remember the physical abuse, even though she doesn't write it down. And I believe your answer was something to the effect of that people can remember things even when they don't write them down.
Yes.
Is being smacked around, is that something, or being strangled, is that something that might be memorable to people?
Just a lack of motivation.
What would approach, please?
Ms. Violet, the question that I asked you was talking about
Break. 10 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Please remember the admonition. 10 minutes. Thank you. You are excused.
Please after the jury.
you about whether or not being strangled and kicked and slapped, is that something that could be memorable to people based on your experience?
It would absolutely be memorable to people.
And so even if somebody doesn't write it down, you think it would be easy for someone to remember those things?
Yes.
We were talking about the rants and sustaining anger and a burst of anger. Remember those questions?
Yes.
And if we look at the May 26th text message, and this is Exhibit 450, even if we don't start way at the beginning, but if we start where there seems to be some anger noted. we're looking at the time at 4:03. Do you see that?
Yes,
And then we go through and there's some, this is where Mr. Alexander is going on and calling her names, things like that, right?
correct.
And then we don't see an end to it until 9:17.
Yes,
So is that about 5 hours?
yes, it is.
And even though there's not a message back and forth every minute in those 5 hours, is it important to you that Mr. Alexander was able to sustain his anger for that period of time?
Yes, it is.
And then after these text messages, to your knowledge, did they then jump on the computer and we're starting to write the instant messaging?
Yes,
And during the instant messaging is when even more of the character assassination occurs, right?
correct.
And so is that important to you then that this longer than a burst of anger?
It's longer than a burst of anger.
And do you consider this when you talk about escalation?
Yes, I do.
You were asked a question about whether or not you were aware that Miss Arias threatened to expose Mr. Alexander for his pedophilic activity, right?
Correct.
And you said you were not aware of that.
No.
If you had learned about that during your assessment, would it be important for you to know that it was a one-time comment over the phone?
Yes,
And that there was no other times when she ever threatened to do that?
yes,
And is it important for you to know that it was something that Miss Arias believed to be truthful, that it actually... Miss Violette, with regard to this information, if it were true, did you see any other patterns of Jodi ever threatening Mr. Alexander with putting forth information?
no, I did not.
Did you ever see any patterns of her threatening him to expose him for his sexual activities?
No, I did not.
And other than her asking him to go to the bishop so they can discuss things, did you ever see her actually threatening that she would go without him?
No, I did not.
And to your knowledge, did Mr. Alexander refuse to go to the bishop?
Yes, he did.
What happens when, in an abusive relationship, what happens when when one person, the abuser, is holding such secrets with the knowledge that his most intimate partner knows of these secrets? Does that cause any further issues with control and fear?
Yes, it does. I mean, that person knows the most about you, and they have the ability, if they chose, to expose who you are or what you've done to the people who mean the most to you and might hold your livelihood in their hands, and certainly your spiritual safety in their hands.
And so could Mr. Alexander feel the need to control Miss Arias regardless of whether or not she ever threatened to expose him?
He could.
You were asked the question of whether or not there was any other information that Mr. Alexander complained of anyone else being a stalker. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he had just said it to Miss Housley, right, on the instant messaging?
Correct.
And was it during that conversation, as you read that part of the conversation as a whole, was there smiley faces and ha-ha-has written in there as well?
Objection, lack of foundation. The time when the statements were made.
During the same conversation, that's what I said.
Overruled. Yes.
Are you aware that Mr. Alexander kept Miss Arias away from his previous girlfriend, Deanna?
Yes.
Objection, lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Did you speak to Miss Arias about this?
Yes.
And based on that, are you aware that Mr. Alexander advised Miss Arias that Deanna was crazy?
Yes.
And did so in an effort to keep them separated?
Objection, state of mind.
Judge, may we approach? Ms. Laviolette, did you interpret the way that Mr. Alexander talked about Deanna to Jodi? Did you interpret that in a way to keep them separated?
Objection, leading.
Overruled.
I did not necessarily interpret it one way or the other. I just saw that there was no contact between the two of them.
And who was preventing that contact?
Objection, lack of foundation.
She has the foundation.
Overruled.
I know that in one of the journal entries that Miss Arias dropped Mr. Alexander off and that Deanna was there and he didn't want, and she wasn't supposed to meet her. So the indication I have is that there was not an encouragement for them meeting, but I don't know how active his role was in doing that.
Okay. But it was Mr. Alexander who asked Jodi to not come in and drop him off.
Correct.
Okay. You were asked questions about Mr. Alexander's journals. Do you remember those?
Yes.
And whether or not he discussed the fact that he abused Jodi in those journals,
Yes.
and whether or not he included certain details about his life in those journals. Do you remember those?
Correct.
So, in the journals of Mr. Alexander that you read, did you ever see him discuss anything about taking a trip to have a soup fight with Jodi?
I don't recall seeing that, no.
Did he write extensively about his activities with Jodi?
No, he did not.
Did he write about his tirades that he had with Jodi?
No, he did not.
Did he write about the character assassination and name-calling that he did to Jodi?
No, he did not.
And ultimately, in reading the instant messages between the two of them, are you aware that these things actually happened?
Yes, they did.
But they were not contained in his journal?
Correct.
When you were interviewing with Miss Arias, you were asked questions about whether or not you suggested answers to her. Do you remember
Correct.
that?
Yes.
Do you think that your assessment is based off of some false information then because you were somehow able to give her the right answers to give you?
No, I don't.
Why not?
Because I ask pretty open-ended questions. They're the kinds of questions I ask when I'm doing an assessment with my clients, and I try to leave them pretty open-ended. I ask things like, do you like your parents or do you like your partner? And it's not, people will say, well, I love my parents and I love my partner. And I said, no, I ask if you like them. Are they your friend? I want to know sort of the status of the relationship, how each person sees it. Do they believe they can trust the other person? So I try to ask open-ended questions. It doesn't mean I always succeed.
Okay. Well, specifically with the question that you might have asked and might have asked about whether or not she used sex to quell his anger.
Yes.
At that point in time, had you already been speaking with Jodi for quite a while?
Yes.
And so had she already given you scenarios about when they would have sex or have sexual contact, things like that?
Yes.
And so at that point in time, did you already have a background and understanding of what was happening between the two of them?
Yes.
You were asked questions about whether or not you've ever testified or worked for, had a male client, right?
Yes.
And besides just criminal, because you, in forensic work, you don't just keep it to criminal, right?
No, I do more family law cases than criminal cases.
Okay. And in family law cases, have you been hired or retained by a man?
Yes, I have.
And have you been able to testify for them? Did you have any problems being retained by a man?
I don't have a problem being retained by a man. I do the same thing with a man that I do with a woman. I look at...
Objection, yeah.
Do you do the same thing with if you're hired by a man or a woman?
Yes, I do the same thing.
How do you do that?
I look at collateral data. I look at what evidence I have to support, any conclusions I'm going to make when I testify. I can still change my mind through the case, which I've done. When I've had the opportunity, I've interviewed lots of people in person or over the phone.
Beyond scope.
She's still explaining.
Overruled.
And I have advised attorneys to settle cases where I feel that they don't have...
Objection, beyond scope.
Sustained.
And have you advised in taking cases? Have you ever had opportunity where you felt that it would not be best for you to testify?
Yes, I have.
And in those situations, do you advise attorneys that maybe they ought to settle the case?
Yes.
You were asked a question in particular about who was the perpetrator of the greater domestic violence. And I think it goes to the fact that we have this physical violence and emotional and psychological abuse on one side from Mr. Alexander to Jodi, and then we obviously have what happened on June 4th, right?
Objection, wrong question. I think.
I don't know what.
Overruled.
You had answered, you had answered no to the question of whether or not Jodi was the greater perpetrator.
Yes.
Why?
Because the domestic violence was prior to June 4th. The defensive episode was on June 4th. And so when I look at something as potentially self-defense, I would see that as, it's certainly violence. There's no hiding that it's not only violence, it's a lot of violence. When someone is acting to defend their lives, I think they do whatever they need to do, and I think at some point may do more than they need to do.
Do you, in your experience, in order for there to be a domestically violent relationship, must there also be physical abuse?
No.
And if there, you were asked a question, if you were to assume that there was no physical abuse in this case, does that change the ultimate opinion with regard to their relationship?
No, it does not.
Why not?
Because psychological abuse, and it's being recognized now. There are books written on it now that are starting to look at verbal abuse, emotional abuse, coercive controlling behavior. Those books are being written now because of the testimonies of people who are on the other end of those kinds of abuse, and the sort of apprehension that can develop with no physical violence. I've worked with people who come into my office and they're shaking and they're withdrawn and they're depressed and they feel powerless, and there has been no physical violence. There's simply been manipulation, control, put downs, character assassinations, great power differences, and the person wanting to be in that relationship has slowly sunk. It's not something that happens all at once. It's gradual, and oftentimes people don't see what's happening to them until it's happened.
And so in this case, given what you have to work with in this case, did you have enough to make that call if you didn't have the physical violence?
If I didn't have enough to make the call, I wouldn't be sitting here.
All right. You were asked questions about, in one of the response to the questions, you talked about that the battered woman doesn't need to be perfect, that the battered women often have faults associated with them as well, right?
Correct.
And what does that mean to you with regard to working with battered women?
That there may be people who are victims or survivors of domestic violence, male or female, that I don't particularly like, or I don't particularly feel have done good things, or I feel that they need a lot of help themselves. Maybe they need their own mental health have their own mental health issues. Maybe they have, maybe it's situational. Maybe it's just on account of the relationship that they've been in. Maybe they do things I don't like. Maybe they have habits I don't like. But it doesn't mean they're not abused. So I don't see it as just a cause and effect situation. I think any of us can get upset. For instance, if we were with someone who is addicted, people who live with addicts get upset. They get upset at that addict. Now, do they have the right to beat and on that addict or belittle them and whatever? Now, that's why people go to Al-Anon, so that they learn how to deal with that. And I think in this case, it would have been terrific if there had been help.
Some type of intervention.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, then, when you work with abusers and in your men's groups, do you, because of what they have done and why they're in the group, are you still able to get along with them and work with them?
I like almost everybody who's ever been in my men's group over the last 34 years. There's probably about 3 or 4 people I haven't liked, and that's why I have a co-facilitator, because hopefully one of us is going to like them. And but they're so multidimensional. They're not one-dimensional people. They have lots of very likable qualities, as do survivors of abuse, have many likable qualities. Nobody's one-dimensional.
And so would it be unfair then to characterize an abuser as purely evil?
It would be totally unfair.
And so when we're talking about Mr. Alexander, is it possible then that he had lots of likable qualities?
I think he did. I think from the things I read that he had really wonderful qualities. That he was able to motivate people, I think, is pretty neat. I think that he had, I remember Miss Arias.
Faint.
I didn't ask this question. I didn't ask this question. I didn't ask. It's not a sec. May we approach?
May continue.
Ms. Laviolette, the fact that Mr. Alexander had all these wonderful qualities, does that necessarily mean that it wouldn't be possible for him to be an abuser?
No, not at all.
You were asked a question about a text message between the two of them where Mr. Alexander tells Miss Arias to empty out her voicemail, right?
Correct.
And that in your understanding, it seemed as though it was an order to her.
Yes.
But that text message alone, does that mean much to you in your overall assessment?
No, it didn't.
You were asked a question about when Miss Arias was being strangled and the fact that she didn't fight back, right?
Correct.
And in your experience with other women or men, in your experience, do people who have been battered, do they have a tendency to still not want to hurt their partner?
Yes, they oftentimes don't believe they're really going to be hurt, and they know they're going to have to hurt back, and they don't want to do it. And sometimes it goes too far, and they have not fought back. But eventually, most people do fight back.
You were asked about this being a love-hate relationship, and you put it and you talked to us about characterizing love-hate relationships more in a high conflict type relationship.
Yeah.
Why is the relationship between Mr. Alexander and Jodi not high conflict?
It's not high conflict because of the abusive dynamics. High conflict really looks at people who may not like each other in a relationship, may talk disrespectfully to each other in a relationship, may have occasional physical kinds of things, but they're basically both, they've got pretty much equal power, and there's no fear in that relationship. And it's not considered a healthy relationship, but it doesn't have all the characteristics of abuse.
You were asked a question about whether or not Miss Arias could be the perpetrator in this case. In other words, if she was the perpetrator of domestic violence for the 2 years that they were together, or under 2 years that they were together, right?
Correct.
And do you think that's true? Do you think that?
That she's the perpetrator?
Yes.
No, I don't.
And you were not privy to, there's no other recorded phone calls other than the phone sex tape, is that right?
Correct.
And so, not being privy to listening to how they interacted on the phone, would you expect that Miss Arias could be psychologically and emotionally abusive to Mr. Alexander over the phone, but then not see evidence of that in their text messages and instant messages?
No, I would expect to see that in their communication style, that there would be sort of a pattern with both of them that would be abusive.
Okay, so when you're talking about patterns, if there's a pattern in their written communication, instant messaging and text messaging of Mr. Alexander being abusive versus, and watching Miss Arias try and talk him down and apologize, things like that, would you expect that a similar or the same type of pattern then in their phone conversations?
I would expect that. I don't have the phone conversations, so
Okay, but just that you would expect it?
yes.
Okay. You told us that you reviewed 7 hours of unedited footage, and these are some of which included interviews of Mr. Alexander's family. Is that right?
Correct.
And is that the only access you were allowed to have to Mr. Alexander's family?
Objection.
Yeah.
Foundation.
Approach.
You were asked the question about whether or not it was common, and to your knowledge, for a battered woman to snap. Do you remember that question?
Yes.
And do Do women living in abusive relationships, do they ever reach a point where they become aggressive, to your knowledge?
Yes.
Do victims of crime and victims of domestic violence, do they reach a point of anger?
Anger is sort of a byproduct of being victimized. If you're robbed, if you're mugged, if somebody breaks into your home, most people get angry, and that is true of any victim, including victims of domestic violence.
What happens when we're talking about domestic violence if somebody is angry as well as afraid?
If you are angry and afraid, there is more likelihood that you would overreact.
Right.
Objection, not affirmation.
Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Mr. Martinez, you may follow up.
Ma'am, one of the things that the jury asked you about was how many times you had testified in a criminal court on behalf of men. Do you remember that question being asked of you?
Yes.
And you said 1 or 2 times, right?
Yes.
What are the names of the 2 men that you testified for in a criminal proceeding?
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled. I testified, I don't know their names, and that's confidential, I believe, but
Well, hold on, let me do it. Do you think the name that you testified on behalf of Miss Arias, do you think that that's confidential?
no.
So these cases involving these men that you testified for, and it's only criminal cases that I'm asking about. Do you understand that?
Yes.
I'm not asking about family violence cases, correct? Do you understand that?
Yes.
I'm only asking about criminal cases where there is a charge pending against somebody, a man, and you testified against that man. On behalf of the man.
I don't know his name. It was a long time ago. He was a police officer, and as it
So,
turned
do you
out...
know his name? Yes or no?
No, I don't know his
So
name.
there's no way for us to check that out, is there, without the name?
No, I don't write the names of people on my CV.
With regard to that one time, was there another time that you testified? And what was the charge against that individual?
The charge against him was domestic violence.
And are you sure it was in criminal court?
Can I explain it?
No, I'm asking whether or not you're sure that the charge against that individual was in criminal court or somewhere else. For example, an administrative hearing.
It was an appeal on a criminal case.
And you're saying it was in criminal court, or was it as part of his job duties?
Objection is valid.
Overruled. It wasn't, are you talking about a Board of Rights? I did that.
I'm asking, you know what a criminal court is, correct?
Yes, I'm trying to answer you.
And I'm asking whether or not that case involving that individual was in criminal court, yes or no? Do you know?
It was in criminal court, and I wrote a report. I didn't actually testify.
Right, that's the point that I'm trying to get across. You were asked by the jurors how many times you had testified on behalf of a man in criminal court. Do you remember that question?
Yes, I do.
That's an answer.
Overruled.
And you remember that you said 1 or 2 times, right?
Objection, ask the answer.
Well, you told us about this individual that we've just been talking about, this police officer. You did not testify in front of a criminal court, did you?
No, I didn't.
So you misrepresented something to the jury, didn't you?
Objection,
Characterizes her testimony.
I was
Yes or no?
I did not testify. I wrote a report in his behalf to go to criminal court.
That's different than testifying in court, isn't it?
Yes, it's different than testifying in
That's
court.
the one time. How about the other time? Give me the name of the other individual.
I said once or twice. That may be, I don't have my CV in front of me. I have 60 cases. What I wrote down was how many times I've testified, period. Then I wrote the numbers of civil cases or family law cases, and the number of criminal cases. I don't know the names of everybody because that spans over 29 years.
Your CV doesn't include, you said, I don't have my CV in front of me, so I can't tell you the other case that I testified to in criminal court. Your CV does not include the times that you testified in criminal court. Does it? Specifically, it doesn't, does it?
Yes, it says testified in different times.
It says you testified at different times, but it doesn't identify the cases specifically, does it?
I don't write the names of the people down, if that's what you're asking.
With regard to the other, there was no second individual that you testified, and I'm talking about man. There was no second man that you testified in criminal court on his behalf. Isn't that true?
I said one or two because I don't remember, Mr. Martinez.
Right. So assuming you don't remember, the question was, by the jury, how many times did you testify on behalf of a man in a criminal court? The answer is either 0 or you don't know, correct?
One written report that I'm sure of. And I was willing to testify, and I was not asked to testify. I wrote a report.
And that means you did not testify if you just wrote the report, correct?
Correct.
You were asked also about the defendant and whether or not she was manipulative. Do you remember being asked those questions?
Yes,
by the jury?
Yes, I do.
And one of the things that you said, well, what you told them was what she does when she's a juvenile. Well, I don't see that as something that carries on to being manipulative later on in life, right?
No, I didn't say that.
Well, didn't you testify about whether or not she was manipulative as a teenager in response to that question?
I said I didn't know if she was manipulative as a teenager, I believe, and I said that there's a lot of difference between how teenagers are and how adults are. So if there was a pattern of manipulation, and that's what I talked about, Mr. Martinez, I didn't see the pattern.
But the question was asked involving manipulation, and isn't it true, and the jurors asked this question today, isn't it true today in response to the question from the jurors, isn't it true that you started to discuss the defendant whether or not she was manipulative as a teenager? Do you remember that or not?
I remember that people asked me what my definition of manipulative was and if I could be wrong about it, and I said yes.
But it was before that. It was immediately or almost immediately after the question about whether or how many times you had testified in criminal court on behalf of men. It was immediately after that. Do you remember that? Does that...
Can you tell me the question specifically?
Ma'am, I'm asking what you remember. I'm not... This only happened just less than 2 hours ago, correct?
I was asked about manipulation, and I answered a question about manipulation.
I'm asking you about time. Let's focus on that. Isn't it true that we started approximately 9:30, correct?
Objection relevant.
Correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure of your question, Mr. Martinez. I'm confused about what you're asking me.
My question is,
You may approach. May continue.
Do you remember your responses that occurred between 9:30 in the morning and now?
Well, if I knew exactly what you were asking me, I would probably remember my responses.
I take it that you're saying that you need your recollection refreshed, right?
That would be great.
So what you're saying then, if you need your memory refreshed, is that you don't remember. That's what you're telling me then, right?
I don't know what your question is, Mr. Martinez. I'm confused about your question, and if I was clear about that, I might be able to answer it.
The question was you know that the jury asked you some questions today, correct?
Correct.
And one of those questions asked about whether or not the defendant was manipulative. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Mischaracterizes the entirety of the question.
Overruled.
And do you remember that in response to a question involving whether or not the defendant was manipulative, you answered that and referred to her during the time that she was a teenager as whether or not she was manipulative? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And you said that, well, the information was received from somebody, and during that time, she may or may not have been manipulative depending on the way you look at the definition, right?
I'm not sure.
Okay, but you remember saying, at least, that if the defendant was manipulative when she was younger, whether it be around the teenage years or on the cusp of the teenage years, you indicated that, well, that manipulation may not carry over to an adult, right?
Correct.
And so based on that, you then told the jury that the defendant was not manipulative in your opinion, right?
Based on materials I'd read.
Absolutely. Based on the materials that you read, you indicated to the jury that it was your opinion that the defendant was not manipulative, correct, this morning?
Based on the materials I read, correct.
Based on the materials you read this morning, in response to a juror question, you said the defendant was not manipulative, correct?
That I didn't have evidence I said I had no evidence of Miss Arias being manipulative. That nothing that I evaluated or assessed indicated to me that she had a pattern of manipulation.
So in your view, you indicated that there was, what you said basically was that she had no pattern of manipulation, right? And you told us about this incident when she was younger, and you said specifically she may have been manipulative then, but not now, right?
I said there was no pattern of manipulation that I saw in the evidence that I read. That's what I said.
And with regard to that particular issue of manipulation, and in response to a juror's question, you did not reference the Purple Plum incident and the defendant's interaction with men, did you?
No, I did not.
And in fact, that was on June 13 of 2008, wasn't it?
Correct.
And there's at least an indication from you that you considered a manipulative incident during the teenage years, and then on June 13 of 2008, to you, that does not establish a pattern, right?
There was a difference in behavior
Yes or no?
following the killing of Mr. Alexander, and there was one other incident that you referenced, Mr. Martinez, and an incident a decade apart from another incident following a trauma does not indicate a pattern. No, it does not.
But when you answered the question to the jurors, you did not reference the Purple Plum incident, correct?
No, I didn't.
And ma'am, one of the other things that you told us was that, well, even if this incident involving the pedophilia, alleged pedophilia, did not occur, that would not change your opinion, then, right? As to whether or not the defendant was abused in this case, right?
Correct.
Ma'am, one of the things that I want you to consider is, and you were asked many questions about the defendant, whether or not she was telling the truth and whether or not she was lying, and you said, well, in my view, she may have been lying after this happened, but that in and of itself does not lead you to believe that she was being untruthful, such that your assessment was affected, right?
That's not what I said, Mr. Martinez.
Well, was your assessment negatively affected by the fact that she may have been untruthful after her killing of Mr. Alexander?
You're still mischaracterizing what I said.
I'm not asking you whether or not, I'm not asking you to agree or disagree with the question. I'm asking you a question. And the question is, is your assessment still the same in light of the fact that the defendant made these lies after the killing of Mr. Alexander?
My assessment about domestic violence remains the same, Mr. Martinez.
And you said in part because you believe that those lies, when people are involved in these kind of circumstances, well, they have a tendency to make things up, right?
Objection, mischaracterizing the evidence beyond scope.
Overruled.
Right?
That when people go through an event that's abhorrent to them, that they are willing to lie about it, and there is self-protection in that, and that's a pretty human response.
Right, and that's what you said, and that's how you viewed the defendant's lies in this case, right?
I saw no pattern of lying.
I'm not asking you if you saw a pattern of lying. You just gave me a definition of what people do after an abhorrent event. I'm asking you if that is how you saw the defendant's lies in this case. Yes or no?
Yes.
And hypothetically speaking, would your opinion that she was somebody who suffered abuse, would it change, hypothetically speaking, if you found out that the defendant had lied as part of these proceedings? Would that change?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
The objection is sustained.
Years later, ma'am, after this abhorrent event, this killing, what if it, hypothetically speaking, it came to your attention, maybe 2, 3, 4 years later, it came to your attention that the defendant had lied about some other event, about something else?
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Yes, you may approach.
Medically speaking, if you found out the defendant 2 or 3 or 4 years later lied about something, whatever it may have been, now that it's removed, if you will, from the original lying about the abhorrent event, would that change your opinion would that change the assessment opinion that you rendered in this court?
It would depend on what the person lied about.
No, I'm asking about the defendant. I'm not asking about a person. I'm asking about
It would
the
depend on
defendant.
what Ms. Arias lied about. It would depend on, once again, I'm looking at a pattern. I look at patterns, Mr. Martinez. I don't look at 3 isolated instances. I look at patterns of behavior. So it would depend. I would take that into account, but I would also want to look at the quality of what you're talking about. Because there's a little white lie, there's a big lie, there's a lie that affects, I mean, I don't know what kind of lie you're talking about.
So what you're saying to me is that to you, a lie really is not a lie, right?
Objection, mischaracterized as arrest.
Testimony.
Overruled.
Right?
That's not what I'm saying at
What you're
all.
saying is that, well, if a person, it's a little white lie to you, that's no big deal, is what I hear you saying. Is that true?
That's not what I'm saying.
Well, isn't a white lie, a little white lie, the same thing as a big lie because they both involve misrepresentation? Isn't that true?
Overruled.
If I'm asked by someone I like, if this makes them look fat and I say no, that's a little white lie.
Objection. There's an objection.
Objection, non-responsive.
All right, ask another question.
Ma'am, what you're saying is you not only are someone who can be somewhat of a lie detector, you're also saying that your experience goes even, or your assessments can be tainted by the fact that some lies you'll consider white lies, some are medium type lies, and some are very big lies, right?
Objection, compound question.
Overruled.
What I'm saying is there's a difference in lies, the quality of lies, and there's a difference in a pattern of lies, whether you characterize somebody as a liar or you characterize somebody as occasionally saying something that isn't the truth, which, by the way, most human beings have done. So I have to look at the context, Mr. Martinez. I'm not black and white. There's a whole lot of gray here.
I'm not asking you to characterize anybody as a liar, am I?
I'm not sure, Mr.
I'm
Martinez.
asking you to tell me what the effect, a lie 2 or 3 years later by the defendant, what that lie would have, if any, what impact it would have in your assessment in this case.
Objection already asked and answered.
Overruled.
I would consider what it was. I would consider the pattern. I would consider the quality. I would look at all kinds of things to see whether it affected my assessment of domestic violence occurring, because that's what I am here to do, to talk about domestic violence.
But in this case, isn't the claim of domestic violence only based on the defendant's statement?
No, not at all.
Well, if you looked at the journals, there is no indication whatsoever of domestic violence there, is there?
I didn't just look at the journals, Mr.
But
Martinez.
ma'am, I'm asking you about the journals specifically. Isn't it true that the journals don't include any indication of domestic violence, correct?
It alludes to cruel, harsh behavior.
Show me if you can, point to me where it says in those journals, Mr. Alexander choked me.
Objection
There's
asked
no-
and answered.
Overruled.
Is there?
There's no specific allegations of domestic violence.
And so in this case, what you're telling us is that you're relying on the defendant's word, correct?
Objection
Incorrect.
asked and answered.
Incorrect.
Your opinion, ma'am, in this case, really, if we look at it, is only as good as what you've sort of been telling us in this case, right?
I am unclear about what
Well,
you mean.
let's do it this way. Isn't it true that with regard to a juror question just now, you told the jury that you had testified on 1 or 2 occasions on behalf of a man? Do you remember telling us that?
Sustained.
And ma'am, afterwards, you indicated that, well, you didn't testify that you wrote a report, right?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
Judge, may we approach? May approach.
You've indicated to the jury that you believe that the defendant, in this case, suffered abuse, correct?
Correct.
Is that certainty that the defendant suffered from abuse the same type of certainty that you gave the jury with regard to your question involving how many people, how many men you had testified to or testified on behalf in criminal cases? Is it the same kind of certainty?
Mr. Martinez,
Yes or no?
I testified for a man in family law. I am not.
Judge, non-responsive. Yes or no? Is it the same type of certainty for both of those answers?
Absolutely not.
So you're saying that with regard to telling this jury that you testified on behalf of men one or two times, with regard to that, did you not take that question seriously?
Objection asked and answered.
Overruled.
I took that question seriously. I have had almost 29 years, and I could not remember, and I should have said, I don't remember, and I know I've testified for men in family law cases. But one report in a criminal case, but I don't remember because I don't have my CV in front of me.
Ma'am, isn't it true to say that you testified in a criminal case knowing that it was only a report? Isn't that at the base a misrepresentation?
Objection asked
On your
and
part?
answered beyond the scope.
Overruled.
I do not remember if I testified. I thought I had testified in one. I said one or two, and I still don't know that I haven't testified in one. But it's been 29 years, and I don't remember. So it would have been more accurate for me to say I don't remember. I remember testifying for men in family law cases. I could say that.
I'm asking about the one where you said you were.
I think I've answered that many times, Mr. Martinez.
I'm asking about the question about the circumstance where you described yourself as testifying on behalf of a man when in fact you only wrote a report.
Objection asked and answered. This has been clarified.
Sustained.
The issues that are presented in this case, ma'am, you resolved them relying, if you will, in part on your education, correct?
Relying on my experience.
So your education played no part in responding to the questions that were posed by the jurors.
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, you don't have a doctorate, correct?
Correct.
Objection beyond the scope.
Approach. Minute recess. Please be back in the designated area in 10 minutes. Please remember the admonition, you are excused. Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, juror number 11 is ill. The court has excused him from further participation in this trial. Mr. Martinez, you may continue.
Ma'am, you indicated a number of things in response to questions by the jury involving Mr. Alexander, didn't you?
Yes,
You indicated, for example, that he irritated women. Do you remember testifying to that yesterday?
I don't remember saying he irritated women.
So if the record reflects that, would you have a quibble with what the record says?
No, I wouldn't.
And you also indicated that he played women. Do you remember saying that?
Yes, I remember saying that.
The other thing that you indicated was that you wish that you could get a complete story from Mr. Alexander, correct?
That would be good, yes.
No, you said you wish that you could get a complete story from Mr. Alexander so that there could be a complete evaluation, correct?
Objection is to the last question.
Mischaracterizes her testimony. Answer.
I don't recall saying so I could get a complete evaluation.
So you're saying that without Mr. Alexander's input, you're getting a complete evaluation in this case, right?
I'm saying I have enough information to look at domestic violence.
And one of the things that we looked at was your continuum. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And you used different words for the people that were involved. And in this case, you told us previously that you believed that Mr. Alexander was a perpetrator, correct?
I believe that I said I believed he was perpetrating domestic violence, yes.
So if he's perpetrating domestic violence, he's the perpetrator of the domestic violence, correct?
Correct.
And that he perpetuated that on the defendant, correct?
Yes.
What was the new term that is not used for victim, that is now used in vogue? What's that called?
Survivor.
And so you indicated that Mr. Alexander was the perpetrator and that Ms. Arias was the survivor, correct?
I don't recall if I said exactly that, but
Judge, may we approach?
May continue.
Ma'am, as part of this evaluation process that you were hired to do, you were paid to do this process, right?
I was paid to do this
Right, I think you
process.
said it was $250 an hour, correct?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
Correct?
Correct.
And to testify is $300 an hour, correct?
To testify is $300 an hour.
Now, ma'am, as part of this process and in reaching your opinion about the domestic violence in this case, isn't it true that you evaluated Mr. Alexander?
I looked at Mr. Alexander's behavior. So did I diagnose Mr. Alexander?
I'm not-
No, I didn't.
I'm not asking if you diagnosed it.
Okay.
I'm asking if you evaluated him such that whatever decision you made, you incorporated it in your opinion in this case.
I evaluated his behavior and I looked at his background to help me assess this case.
And so you evaluated the behavior of a human being, correct?
Yes, he's a human being.
And after the evaluation of this behavior, you reached certain conclusions, right?
Correct.
One of the conclusions that you reached in evaluating his behavior was that he was a liar, right?
I reached the opinion that he told lies.
Well,
No, I didn't call him a liar. I said he told lies to people, and those were in his words. Those were in his communications with other people, that he professed to being a virgin, and that was a lie.
so people who tell lies are liars, aren't they, by definition?
Not everybody who tells lies is a perpetual liar, but he had a habit of telling a lie.
Right.
Yes.
No one's saying perpetual. We're saying liar. You added the word perpetual to this, didn't you, just now?
Yes, I did.
My question is, an individual who has a pattern of lying, which is what you said about Mr. Alexander, that is a liar, correct?
Correct.
Vague.
Line of when the person's a liar. Sustained.
In this case, ma'am, whatever time frame you used when you testified and spoke to the jury, you indicated that Mr. Alexander had a pattern of lying, right?
Correct.
And you just said that if anybody who has a pattern of lying is a liar, correct?
Objection. Foundation.
Overruled. I said that Mr. Alexander lied. Yes.
And he had a pattern in addition to that, right?
Correct.
And anybody who has a pattern is a liar, correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
The other thing that you told us about Mr. Alexander is that he escalated these arguments between him and the defendant, right?
I said that he had a pattern of escalating.
All right, and you called them rants, correct?
Yes.
And you called them rants based on the written word, correct?
Correct.
You couldn't see, or you have no way of knowing what his demeanor was when he was writing that, do you?
No, I don't.
And in fact, you've told us that 90% of all communication in this particular area is nonverbal, right?
You can read into a rant.
I know that you can read into a rant, but I'm asking you something different. Isn't it true that you testified to this jury that 90% of all communication in clinical settings is nonverbal? Yes or no?
Face-to-face communication is what I said. When we are face-to-face, about 90% of our communication, and that's a saying in the field.
And it's a saying that you advocated when you told us about it, right?
Objection beyond scope.
It's already been clarified.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
In, for example, a text message, like the text messages that were referenced as part of the questions from the jurors. Isn't it true that in those, you don't even get to see the interaction of the two people, do you?
In the text messages?
Yeah.
You get to hear the communication between the two. You get to see it on the page.
Right. You get to see words going across the page. That's what you get, right?
Correct.
You don't get to see or hear inflection, do you?
I think it would be hard or difficult to think that somebody was in a really good mood calling somebody those names.
Am I asking you whether somebody was in a good mood or not?
I think.
Yes or no? Am I asking you that?
No, you're not asking me that.
I'm asking you about the limitations involved in a text message. You understand that there are limitations about a text message, right?
Objection beyond scope.
Overruled.
Right?
I suppose there are limitations as there are limitations between the spoken word.
We're not talking about the spoken word. We're talking about text messages. Do you understand that?
I understand you're talking about
I want
limitations.
to talk to you about text messages.
Only one person speaking at a time. He's interrupting her answer.
Yes, that is correct. One at a time. Mr. Martinez, let her finish her response or ask the court to find her non-response.
Are you saying that you are as effective in conducting an evaluation, such as in this case, when you have the person, a clinical interview, and for one person, and then with regard to the other person, all you have is the written word. You're saying that's just as good, right?
I'm saying that in many cases, that's all we have.
I'm not asking you if that's all you have, am I?
You're asking me what's more effective, and it depends on the situation, Mr. Martinez. That I could be having a clinical interview with somebody who is totally, misrepresenting themselves. I rely on the consistency of the information that I have. And if there's consistency across sources, it makes a difference.
Are you done?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
My question is different than that. I'm asking you to think of a situation where you have a conversation with an individual. I want you to compare that clinical interview to the circumstance where all you have is a text message. Are you saying that both of them are equal in terms of making an evaluation of what the person is saying, thinking, feeling at the time that the statements are made?
I'm saying they're different.
I'm asking you which one is better. That's what I'm asking you.
I'm saying that sometimes one is better than the other, and I don't know what is better all of the time, that I have to look at what I've got. And if I get a clinical interview, that's a good thing. But I've had clinical interviews, for instance, between people who come into my men's group and their partners, and they're very different interviews, and the information is very different. So you can't always say one is better than the other. I can't always say that.
Doesn't that go contrary to what you just told the jury earlier today, what you just said now?
I said I would like to have had an interview with Mr. Alexander,
Right.
and I would have.
And that means that by you saying that you would have wanted the interview, that means that you believe that it is better to have spoken to Mr. Alexander as part of this evaluation than to just look, for example, at text messages, right?
You want me to say it's better. I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying there's more information. I get different information. I'm not saying I didn't have enough information.
I'm not asking you if you had more information. You're saying then that it is not better to have the other person involved in this relationship to talk to them than as opposed to a text message? Is that what you're saying?
Objection, asked to be answered beyond the scope is being clarified.
Overruled.
I'm not saying that it's better, and I'm not saying that it's worse. I'm saying that comparatively, it would have been good to be able to compare the two stories. What I have is information that I think allows me to compare the two stories. I always want more information if I can get it, Mr. Martinez.
Ma'am, one of the things that you told us was that going into this particular evaluation was that you believe the defendant based on the readings, correct?
Based on which readings?
Whatever readings you made, I don't know.
Objection
That-
is characterized as her testimony as going into this evaluation. She believed her.
Overruled.
I didn't go into this evaluation believing Miss Arias. I went into this evaluation, as I hope everybody does, going in with an open mind and looking at what's there and what I can base my opinions on.
And then you sat and you spoke to her for 44 hours, correct?
Different periods of time, yes, I did.
And during that time, there was other materials that was provided to you, right?
Correct.
And nowhere during that time did you speak to Mr. Alexander, correct?
Correct.
Interesting.
And you would agree, ma'am, that your evaluation in this particular case is defective because you only spoke to the defendant who has lied and not to Mr. Alexander.
I would disagree totally with your
Thank you.
conclusion that I'm
Thank you.
defective.
I don't have anything else.
We approach her?
You may. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you for your patience. We were talking about scheduling issues. On Monday, please be back at 1:30, but please have your cell phones with you or be near a phone where we can reach you on Monday morning around 10 o'clock. As of right now, plan to be here at 1:30 on Monday. Are there any questions? I see there is a question in the box. Council, please approach. One additional question from the jury. Was Ms. Arias' story from October 2011 through November 2011 consistent with the story as we know it today?
I didn't hear her testimony, so it was consistent with what I knew from October 11. From the time that I started interviewing her, her story was consistent with me, but I wasn't privy to her testimony.
Any other questions from the jury? Any follow-up? Ms. Wilmot?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Martinez?
When you say her story was consistent, the story included the fact that, as you related to us, that the shooting occurred in the closet, correct?
That was not her story. That was a mistake that I made in writing it down. I looked at some other reports, and there was a report. I have different notes, Mr. Martinez, and so on one of the notes I may make no mention whatsoever of the closet, and I made notes from what other reporters said, I believe Dr. Samuels or Dr. DeMarte, and I wrote those notes down too. So I misspoke on that, but I didn't, from my interview with Ms. Arias, have that the shooting occurred in the closet.
You did, when you spoke to the prosecutor back in November 2012, you did tell him that the shooting occurred in the closet, correct?
I did.
And
I misspoke. I took two different reports, as I said.
the answer is yes.
Okay.
No, is that yes?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Monday, 1:30. Please have a nice weekend. Remember the admonition.
Your Honor.
Sit right there. So the jury has left the courtroom. Please be seated. Ms. Laviolette, we will need you to return on Tuesday to complete your testimony unless I release you from your subpoena prior to that time. There is another issue that I think you are aware of the additional issue. So we will need you to be back here on Tuesday. With regard to the time, I know that you haven't I had some other issues, but this is a priority. So because you cannot be here on Monday, you need to be here on Tuesday. So it's either Monday or Tuesday. I'll allow you to decide which you'd prefer, which date you'd prefer to come back.
And I may have follow-up tests that
Yes,
I can do.
Ms. Lila, don't tell me about your personal issues. Here's my concern. My concern is that we will have a conversation on Monday on the record after everyone has had an opportunity to follow up on the issue we've discussed. And at that time, I will hear anything else. You will have made preparations and we can talk about it at that time. All right, but plan to be back here on Tuesday. As of right now, you are still under subpoena. Counsel, you may. All right, on Monday at 11 o'clock, Ms. Wong, you are in the back of the courtroom, is that correct?
Yes, I am, Your Honor.
Will you be here to testify? All right, I guess then I will order you to be here at 11 o'clock to testify. I understand that you have an attorney. If there is any issue, he can raise that. We will be here starting at 9:30 on Monday. All right? Anything else, council?
No, I think I'm-
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.